She had dreams of becoming a nurse and was just days away from the moment she worked her whole life for. But 23-year-old Tamilore Odunsi would never get the chance to make that dream come true. Houston police say the nursing student was found stabbed to death inside her apartment, allegedly killed by her roommate, Chester Grant, after an argument over their pets. The two had been living together for about 2 months. Odunsi had been documenting her journey to becoming a nurse, sharing her hard work and counting down the days to graduation. Now she'll never get to walk across the stage, and the man accused of taking her life is facing decades behind bars. I'm your host, Kennedi Walker, and I'll walk you through the details. It was a somber scene at Texas Women's University in Houston. What should have been a day of joy and celebration turned into a quiet remembrance of a classmate lost too soon. Instead of Tamilore Odunsi walking across the stage to receive her nursing pin, it was her sister who accepted it on her behalf. Odunsi, just 23 years old, was killed just days before graduation, a milestone meant to mark the start of a promising future, now overshadowed by unimaginable loss. Originally from the United Kingdom, Odunsi had shared her journey on TikTok as a British student navigating life in the United States. She often posted study tips and motivational messages, encouraging others to follow their dreams and join the healthcare field she loved so deeply. But before she could fully live out her own dream, her life was cut short. On April 26, Houston police were called to her apartment for a welfare check. According to the Daily Mail, a friend of Odunsi's father contacted authorities after her family couldn't reach her. When police arrived at the apartment, they found blood on the rear patio. Inside, officers discovered Odunsi on the kitchen floor. She had suffered multiple stab wounds and was pronounced dead at the scene. Police also found her roommate, 40-year-old Chester Grant, inside the apartment. According to investigators, Grant had attempted to take his own life. He had stabbed himself 6 times, including once in the neck. Detectives say the two had argued a few days earlier over the cats they both kept in the apartment. That dispute, they believe, escalated into deadly violence. Odunsi and Grant had only been roommates for a few months and did not know each other prior to living together, according to police. Grant was hospitalized for several days to be treated for his injuries. Once released, he was taken into custody and charged with murder. Odunsi's family created a GoFundMe to raise money to return her body to the United Kingdom. In a statement posted online, her family said she had moved to the United States to pursue her dream of becoming a nurse, dedicating herself to a career of care and service. They shared that she had a passion for helping children and had hoped to make a difference in young lives through her work in healthcare. In the end, Tamilore Odunsi didn't get to cross the stage or receive the nursing pin she had worked so hard for. Instead, in a quiet and emotional moment, her sister accepted it on her behalf. Now a symbol of both achievement and heartbreak, and a reminder to those who knew her of the passion and purpose she carried every day. And joining me to talk more about this is criminal defense attorney Nicole DeBoard. Nicole, thank you so much for coming on today. Let's just jump right in. So the suspect is charged with murder. Is there a possibility that prosecutors could pursue additional charges in this case?
I doubt it, only because murder is about as severe as it gets. There's not a whole lot of benefit in terms of prosecution resources to trying to go after this individual for additional charges. Murder in Texas carries anywhere from 5 to 99 years or life in the penitentiary. So there's not a lot of reason for prosecutors to seek additional charges.
What does the prosecution need to prove in a case like this to secure a conviction, even though it seems like everything, the writing's on the wall?
Right, exactly. It does seem fairly cut and dry. In Texas, there is no premeditation required. It is simply whether or not the individual charged caused the death of another intentionally.
And I know you just mentioned that he could be sentenced anywhere from, what did you say, 5 to 99 years. Could prosecutors pursue the death penalty in a case like this, or is that unlikely?
Unlikely in a case like this. Death penalty usually has to come with an additional crime in the state of Texas. So, for example, if it were a robbery or a sexual assault, or if it was a murder of a child under the age of 6, those are the kinds of terms that usually set a death penalty making that available. But in this circumstance, it sounds like from what we know, from the very little facts that have been shared, it sounds like someone got upset with their roommate, and this is what happened.
Is there a chance for parole in a murder conviction in Texas?
There are circumstances where certain people can be paroled. There are also circumstances where the prosecution can charge the case in a way that doesn't allow for parole. So you could get life without parole for certain types of murder.
And can you just tell me more about that? How often do cases like this result in just life sentences here in Texas?
So jurors in Texas are the ones who choose ultimately if this person decides that they want to have a jury trial. Jurors decide what the punishment is. So the jurors have anywhere from 5 to 99 years or life at their disposal. And that assumes that the person who is being charged doesn't have any prior convictions. If a person has prior convictions, the sentence floor can go up. And so a jury would hear the facts of the case and determine what they thought the appropriate sentence would be. And then ultimately they render that verdict. And it can be really just a number anywhere between 5 and 99 years or life in prison.
How does Texas law typically treat cases involving roommate disputes that turn violent? Is it considered domestic violence?
It can be. It can certainly be considered domestic violence. So a member of the family, according to Texas law, can be someone who lives in the household, even though they're not related by blood or even potentially dating. So it could be a circumstance where the prosecution decides that there's a benefit to charging him as a quote unquote family member. And so we simply need to wait and see exactly how they decide to pursue the case. But in this circumstance, again, because jurors have at their disposal already such a broad range of punishment, there may not be a substantial benefit to the prosecution charging it in that way and adding the additional burden. Although, it could be that they add it, maybe a jury finds it, maybe a jury doesn't find it, and it won't really have that much impact on getting the conviction itself.
When it is added, tell me just about the benefits of that. Like what makes it different when it, is considered domestic violence in a household situation. Maybe they aren't spouses or dating, but, roommates.
Sure, it can impact the ability for the person to receive parole, and it can also impact the sentencing range in the case.
Okay, so in this case, and we've seen or we've read some of the evidence according to police, but what kind of evidence would investigators likely collect in a case like this in order to get that conviction that they're looking for?
So what they're doing is going out to the scene and trying to reconstruct as much as they possibly can without having to rely on the only eyewitness who's there. Unfortunately, the person who was the victim in this case passed away and cannot speak for herself. So detectives are going to do everything that they possibly can to try to put the puzzle pieces together in hindsight so that they're not dependent on, what they're hearing from the person who actually did the stabbing and who is on trial. This is going to include blood evidence. This is going to include potential video footage, likely digital evidence from cell phone communications. There can be all kinds of things that law enforcement will collect to try to make sure they understand the complete picture.
And law enforcement is saying that this was a dispute over pets. Could the dispute over the cats be considered a crime of passion, and would that lessen charges at all?
It's possible, although unlikely. We do have a provision in Texas law that is essentially crime of passion, which would allow a jury to determine whether or not a murder was committed in such throes of passion that the sentencing should be limited. So, for example, if a jury found the requisite elements that this person was so inflamed by the types of conduct or type of conduct that would have inflamed the ordinary person to not be able to control themselves, and that's in very over basic terms, the jury could find that this was what you're referring to as a crime of passion, and that would put a cap on the sentencing at 20 years. It seems a little bit unlikely given what limited information we have about this case, but certainly that will be what they're trying to look for when they put together a defense.
But usually when we hear about crimes of passion, right, we may hear about, a husband walking in on the wife having an affair, and, he was just so riled up that he may have killed the boyfriend that the wife was sleeping with. That's usually what we hear when we think of crime of passion. With pets, could that be considered the same thing?
It's possible, right? But again, based on the limited information that we have about this case, it does seem somewhat unlikely. But this wouldn't be something that we would know until this case is concluded. This is not something that would be litigated in advance, for example. This would be something really put out for the jury's consideration during a trial, which could be years in the future.
And police say that the suspect tried to harm himself. If you look at his mugshot, you can see, a huge bandage on his neck, which is where they say that he tried to stab himself. How might Grant's self-inflicted injuries factor into the case, if at all?
It's hard to say. I mean, prosecution will certainly be arguing that this person, did this because they felt so guilty about what they had done, so that it's a sign of guilt. It could be evidence of severe mental health issues that the defense is going to need to look at and determine whether or not this is somebody having a psychiatric episode. It is just one more piece of the puzzle.
And the family is saying that the victim and the suspect didn't really know each other. They were essentially strangers before moving in. How significant is the fact that they were essentially strangers before living together?
I think it just adds a little bit of scariness ultimately to the facts of the case. I mean, again, these cases really boil down to a jury gets to hear what happened, and that's going to be based on the evidence presented by the prosecution. The fact that this nursing student ended up moving in and sharing, an apartment with somebody that she barely knew, who very well may have had extensive problems. Clearly something was off that she didn't know about. It adds to the fear factor, quite frankly. And, jurors are certainly just human beings, and they're going to be able to consider how that impacts their thought on this individual's dangerousness, whether or not he knowingly committed the crime, whether or not he should receive a long sentence as a result of sort of that fear factor that this likely creates.
Could the family sue the apartment complex or landlord if there were prior safety concerns?
It's possible, if there were things about this individual that were already known to the apartment complex, or if they failed to do some sort of background check and it turns out that this individual, and I have no idea if this is so, had any kind of violent criminal past, that could be something that the family would look at in terms of litigating whether or not the apartment has some responsibility, and what the arrangement was between the two concerning how they decided to become roommates and if they had any kind of contract between each other.
Right. And I'm just speculating here, but, sometimes it may be documented if a person is having, roommate issues. Maybe they reach out to the landlord trying to, get out or have, get another lease or something like that. If that is documented, how would that play into the case?
Well, it's probably not going to be super important in terms of the actual murder charges in criminal court, but it would be informative to the family deciding whether or not there was potentially civil exposure for the apartment complex. If the apartment complex should have been aware or should have notified one of the residents of a potential violent past, and again, we have no idea whether or not that's the case, that could put some responsibility onto the apartment complex. On the other hand, the apartment complex would certainly come back and say, these are adults. They had the right to choose if they wanted to room with each other, and that's not our business or responsibility to get in the way.
What kind of defense could Chester Grant potentially argue? If you were his attorney, how would you go about fighting this case?
First, I would want to learn a little bit about his mental health history to determine whether or not there were ongoing difficulties, whether he was receiving treatment, what kinds of personal issues he had in his life that maybe would have impaired his ability to make decisions that were responsible. So these would be things that I would want to investigate early on. I mean, this to me seems like what we would call a mitigation case. Just, it's not a whodunit. And so we would want to find out what led this individual, if he doesn't have a violent past, to commit such an atrocious act.
And you spoke on this earlier, that potentially mental health may be a factor in his defense given the attempted suicide. Can you explain more about that, like how that works when a suspect has attempted to take their own life after, being accused of a crime like this one?
Sure. I mean, there are several red flags here. I mean, here we have an argument over potential, cats in the apartment. I mean, most people who have arguments over pets don't stab each other. So we have that red flag, which is pretty substantial. There was some decision making that went severely awry. So I would want to understand a little bit more about that. I would want to have a healthcare professional evaluate him to determine, what his mental health status was. And certainly the fact that he at some point had recognition that he did something he was not happy with, right? By stabbing his roommate to death and attempted to kill himself has some meaning. And we'd like to, get a healthcare professional to take a close look at the case to determine what was happening there.
What is the process for determining if Grant is mentally competent to stand trial?
He would have to be evaluated by a forensic psychologist to determine whether or not he was in control of his faculties. Was he in such a mental health state that he did not know the difference between right and wrong? And that's an interesting problem here with a person who actually does try to commit suicide after committing the act, because that does demonstrate some knowledge of behavior that's outside the bounds of the law, or at least morally wrong. So again, it's going to need to be a forensic psychiatrist who can actually evaluate this individual and determine what his psychiatric condition was at the time.
How does Texas law exactly handle cases where the accused has attempted suicide after the crime, if they handle it differently at all?
I don't know that they really handle it differently at all. They want him well enough, which he apparently was, to go to court, be told by a magistrate exactly what he's been charged with. And now the case can proceed through the regular district court channels. In other words, the prosecution has filed a charge. They will appear in court. The defense will seek discovery, meaning they will seek information about why the prosecution believes they have the right suspect and what the evidence is to prove their case. That will be evaluated over a period of likely many months. If the defense has their own investigation that they want to conduct, they will do that. And the judge ultimately will set a trial date, and he will be tried if he decides not to take a plea.
And if he is found, mentally incompetent, like what happens if he's found guilty but mentally ill? Then what?
So if a person is not competent to stand trial, then they cannot stand trial to be found guilty. What happens is they would go into a treatment facility where they would remain until potential competency could be restored. If competency was restored, he would be brought back to court to be tried. So he would be competent and then could be tried. If it was determined that he was insane at the time of the stabbing, then that is a different calculus, because what happens in that circumstance is he cannot be found guilty of a crime while he was insane, if that is what ultimately the doctors determine to be true. And so the prosecution and the defense could fight about that, whether he was or was not insane. And if he is found not guilty by reason of insanity, then he would be placed into a mental health care facility of the states and potentially reevaluated on at least a yearly basis to determine whether or not he could or should remain in custody as a ward of the state for many years to come.
Could it be argued that the fact that he attempted suicide, it may suggest remorse, and could that influence sentencing at all?
It could influence sentencing, but it's generally speaking not. It's not necessarily mitigating. It's one of these circumstances where people think, well, he must have felt really bad because he attempted suicide. But the prosecution oftentimes will flip that on its head and say, well, he felt bad moments after, and to such a degree to demonstrate real knowledge of the damage that he had done. And so it can be actually damaging to the defense's case.
And just touching back on the fact that these were two roommates, are there warning signs or even red flags that people should look out for with roommates legally?
That's such a great question. I mean, and this is a circumstance where people try to get a roommate throughout college, or in this circumstance, nursing school, to save money and to be able to afford to live and go to school. There's message boards, there's, ways to meet up with people that you don't know. And the only thing that I can think of to suggest is use the same care that you would have before inviting someone to stay in your own home to try to determine as much as you can about this person's background and history.
Are there legal protections? Like, what legal protections do renters have if they feel unsafe living with someone?
Now, that I don't know the answer to. I mean, if someone feels unsafe, they should contact the police, or they should move. Whether or not you're going to be on the hook for a few $100s or a few $1,000s, even as rents go these days, is it worth your life and your safety? Sometimes a decision has to be made that's not to your best economic benefit if it means that you're going to have to choose your life or your safety over your money, and that's sometimes the best answer. And then you can seek counsel who's familiar with what could be done to force the other roommate to potentially pay the bills, but that would be landlord-tenant law potentially, and way outside the bounds of what we do in our practice.
Absolutely. Well, we spoke about the potential of a trial here. What type of timeline, like, for a case like this, how long does it take for it to even get to trial?
It depends on the case. Every court is different in Harris County, which is the county where cases that happen in Houston are tried. And so it depends on exactly how many cases are in front of you that also want a trial. And, that some courts have a high number, some courts have a lower number. It depends on how long it takes for the law enforcement agencies who did the investigation to turn over the materials to the prosecution to then turn over to the defense for review. It depends on how long it takes doctors to evaluate a client and get back a report so that people can make intelligent decisions about the appropriateness of moving forward. It can take a while for discovery that the defense has requested or the prosecution is seeking to be completed in full. So these are all factors that dictate how long a case can take to get to trial. And of course, the judge ultimately controls the schedule. Sometimes the judge will push hard to make a case go more quickly, but usually seasoned judges who understand that both sides are working hard to get to justice and to the right result will allow good attorneys to do their work, even if it takes time.
And sometimes they could just result in a plea, right?
And sometimes it can result in a plea, and sometimes it's not that the parties are fighting over, again, who done it, who did this crime, but what should the appropriate sentence be? And so they could even have the court make that decision just based on the evidence that's available to the court, provided by both parties. It could be that they decide that whatever the prosecution is offering after some negotiation and thorough evaluation of the materials is the appropriate resolution, and the case could be resolved. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, don't offer this person a plea, or this person should never be offered a plea. If that happened in a courthouse, justice would grind to a halt. Just because a person is given an opportunity to plead guilty to a case for a particular resolution doesn't mean that it's some kind of lesser resolution than what a judge or jury would give to that person. Sometimes it's just making the decision to appropriately resolve the case based on the facts at hand. And sometimes it's just the right thing to do for both sides.
Absolutely. Well, this was definitely very informative. Nicole, thank you so much for coming on today.
Super. Thank you so much for having me.
Chester Grant is being held in the Harris County Jail on a $500,000 bond. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.